We've been talking a lot about borrowing words from other languages, but for the next few minutes, I want to talk about the principles behind this act. And we're also going to talk a little bit about slang since we are talking in the last few weeks, we've been talking about language expansion. So let's begin. First, let me say that borrowing words is like borrowing a tissue. We don't give it back. The word assimilates to the culture borrowing it in sound and sometimes meaning. The words that are borrowed may name objects or activities associated with another culture. For example, samovar or geisha, or the loan words may have objects or activities from other cultures that have been assimilated into English, like bagel and skunk. The loan word may express an existing concept or thing not previously named in English, as in Spanish vigilante or Japanese tycoon. There has to be certain conditions present in order for words to be shared between cultures. First, there has to be contact between different cultural groups. If a group is isolated, it obviously can't borrow from other groups. So there must be some access, either digital or face-to-face. This contact also has to be couched in familiarity and or openness and willingness to learn about new things. So when a word is first borrowed, it may only be used around the group it came from. For example, if I borrow a word from another language, I'm not going to use it indiscriminately around members of all different cultural groups because they don't know what the word means or its significance, right? Like, I'm not going to use this word around my family, especially if they weren't with me when I acquired this word. They'll have no clue what I'm talking about. So a new loan word will at first only be used around users of the word's original language, and it may be embedded in the borrowing language depending on how close the two cultures are related and how the two cultures exchange ideas or information. So then the question becomes, how do we go from a limited release to a loan word becoming common? There are a couple of different factors here. First, the initial borrowers may or may not know the source language when they use it, so they may not recognize that it's a borrowed word at all. And the longer a word has been in the language, the more it resembles the native language and becomes embedded in the culture. For example, a commonly used word like spaghetti no longer sounds foreign, and so people don't think that when they're saying the word, they're using Italian, but they are. Conventionalization is the process through which a word becomes more visible or audible in a community. The more we see a word, like spaghetti, the more conventional or average it is. When a loan word is conventionalized, its borrowers may reproduce the word or give it the sounds and characteristics of their own language. This is when we anglicize a word, okay? When loan words are anglicized, users may no longer recognize them as loan words. All right, so we have traditional sources for our loan words, languages that were in contact with English as it was developing from Old English, and you should know these by now. But we've also added some new sources in the past century or so. Okay, so French is still a common language that English borrows from, but we don't anglicize the words we borrow anymore. Instead, we just pronounce them as they are in French. When we borrow words today, they might be associated with specific items in the parent culture, like Scandinavian saga or Celtic plaid, or we might borrow within a specific domain, as in borrowing Italian words for music, food, and art. Okay, so many of the new sources are not from Indo-European languages. They just happen to be languages English has come into contact and had a cultural exchange with. Okay, so like Japanese, Chinese, Arabic, and Hebrew. Calques, new term for you, are borrowed compounds or phrases that we translate from the original language into a new language. So the sentiment is borrowed, but not necessarily the phonology. For example, French nom de plume is someone's pen name, and Italian la dolce vita becomes the good life. Because the phrases are translated into English, it's unlikely that people know they're using foreign phrases. Okay, so now I want to move on to something that I find fascinating, that is slang. The PBS series, Do You Speak American, calls slang the common denominator. It's commonly used language for common people. So what does slang do? Well, it all contains subtext, and using and understanding that subtext marks speakers and listeners as members of the same group. I know you're part of my group because you speak like I do. So for example, a person who uses modern slang is either a member of a younger generation or they're trying too hard. Slang is also a way to rebel against the constant expectation that we'll all speak properly all the time. That's exhausting. And for most of us, that's not happening. So the creation of slang is not unlike word creation methods of previous versions of English. Some slang is made by blending, some by clipping, and some by acronyms. And I love that several of you picked YOLO as the word you just wanted to die from the English language from our previous discussion board about new OED words. It is technically slang, right? It was a slang word created using acronyms. I know, I don't like it either. Linguists note that because slang is constantly changing, one word rises to prominence as another falls. It can be difficult to study slang. There are, however, a few generic statements we can make about types of slang. Okay, so here they are. First, the 4 factors most likely to produce slang: youth, oppression, sports, and vice. The more prevalent an object is in daily life, the more numerous and diverse its slang terms will be. Jonathan Leiter, a linguist and apparent slang expert, claims that most slang terms are stand-ins for good, bad, sex, drunkenness, and nonsense. Slang's propensity for change is part of its character. What makes slang slang is that it changes constantly. Because it is timely and specific to a certain group in a specific context, it tends to have a short shelf life. And it must change constantly, or, here's the trick, regenerate. Okay, so here's an example. Let's look at the word great. Okay, and let's look at how it changed over the course of a few decades. Right? It went from groovy to radical to cool to lit. Right? I don't say lit, but I'm from that kind of cool age group. But all of that means the exact same thing, right? And there are people who study how slang shifts through time. Sadly, however, we gradually stop acquiring new slang as we age, each new generation or cultural group develops its own slang, which is meshed in its identity. For most of our adult lives, we use the core slang of our youth, and when we get old enough, we stop using slang altogether. So now I want to close the lecture by talking about what some linguists and what some writers have said about slang. The first is John Algeo, who called slang a deliberately undignified form of speech. Then we have Anne Curzon, who called slang ennobling. I like that word, ennobling. Sorry. Fundamental to the word formation processes that are eternally active in language. Emerson called slang useful, and Whitman said slang is wholesome. However, my favorite, and it's probably a lot of people's favorite, comes from Carl Sandburg, who said that slang was a language that takes off its coat, spits on its hands, and gets to work. Okay, so there it was, a little brief lecture on loan words and slang words, how we kind of got to where we are today in terms of terminology and slang. If you have any questions, as always, please don't hesitate to email me, and I will talk to you all next week.